My name is Jessica Martinez, and I'm 31 years old. For the past 8 years, I've been living what I thought was my dream life as a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital of Denver, working in the neonatal intensive care unit. Every morning at 6:15, I'd wake up in my cozy studio apartment just 12 minutes from the hospital, brew my coffee in the French press I'd bought myself as a graduation gift, and prepare for another day caring for the tiniest, most vulnerable patients. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My apartment was small but perfectly organized. The Murphy bed folded up against the wall each morning, transforming the space into a living room with a sage green love seat I'd found at an estate sale and reupholstered myself. The kitchen was compact but functional, with open shelving displaying my collection of vintage blue mason jars filled with dried herbs and spices. I'd painted an accent wall deep navy blue and hung floating shelves to display my nursing textbooks alongside novels I'd collected over the years. The bathroom had been my biggest splurge. I'd saved for 8 months to install subway tile and replace the basic fixtures with brushed bronze hardware. The medicine cabinet was organized with precision, each skincare product and medication in its designated spot. Everything about my space reflected years of careful planning and financial discipline. At the hospital, I'd worked my way up from a new graduate nurse to a senior NICU nurse with specialized certifications in neonatal resuscitation and developmental care. My badge holder displayed multiple certification pins, each representing months of additional training and examinations. The other nurses often came to me with questions about complex cases, and I'd been selected to precept new hires, helping them transition from nursing school to the intense reality of caring for premature infants and newborns with critical conditions. My typical shift started at 7 in the morning and ended at 7:30 in the evening. Those 12 and a half hours were intensive, requiring constant vigilance and emotional resilience. I'd move between isolates, monitoring tiny patients who weighed less than 2 pounds, administering medications through IV lines thinner than a strand of hair, and supporting families experiencing the most frightening time of their lives. The work was demanding but deeply fulfilling. I'd witnessed countless miracles in that unit, babies who weren't expected to survive going home healthy months later. I'd held parents as they grieved losses that seemed incomprehensible, and celebrated with families when their 26-week preemie finally reached 5 pounds and could go home. My salary as a senior NICU nurse was comfortable for a single woman with modest expenses. After taxes and benefits, I brought home approximately $4,800 monthly. My rent consumed $1,800 of that, leaving me with enough for groceries, utilities, car payment, and still putting away $800 each month into my savings account. Those savings represented more than just money. They represented my independence, my security, and my future plans. I had been methodically building toward a goal that felt both ambitious and achievable: buying my own house within the next 3 years. Not a condo or townhome, but an actual house with a yard where I could plant a garden and maybe eventually provide a stable home for foster children. The idea of fostering had been growing in my mind for years. Working in the NICU, I'd seen too many babies who needed temporary homes while their birth parents worked through addiction recovery or other challenges. I'd completed the initial training classes and knew that having my own home would make me a more attractive candidate for placement agencies. My financial planning was meticulous. I'd calculated that with my current savings rate and projected salary increases, I'd have enough for a down payment on a modest 3-bedroom house by my 34th birthday. I'd already started researching neighborhoods with good schools and reasonable property taxes, spending weekend afternoons driving through subdivisions and imagining which houses might become available in my price range. The Denver housing market was competitive, but not impossible for someone with steady income and good credit. I'd been pre-approved for a mortgage and had established relationships with two real estate agents who specialized in first-time homebuyers. My credit score was excellent, thanks to years of paying every bill on time and keeping my credit utilization low.
Beyond the house goal, I'd also been investing in my professional development. I'd completed my Bachelor of Science in Nursing through an online program while working full-time, graduating with honors despite the challenge of balancing coursework with 12-hour shifts. My next goal was to pursue a master's degree in neonatal nursing, which would qualify me for advanced practice roles and significantly increase my earning potential. The application process for the master's program was intensive, requiring letters of recommendation, a personal statement, and completion of prerequisite courses in statistics and research methods. I'd been taking those prerequisite courses one at a time through the community college, attending evening classes twice a week after work. My daily routine was structured but satisfying. On work days, I'd wake at 6:15, spend 30 minutes doing yoga or stretching, then shower and dress in my scrubs. I'd pack my lunch in the insulated bag I kept stocked with healthy snacks and a large water bottle. The commute to work was peaceful, giving me time to mentally prepare for whatever challenges the day might bring. On my days off, I maintained a different but equally purposeful routine. I'd sleep until 8, then spend the morning cleaning and organizing my apartment. Afternoons were for grocery shopping, meal prep for the week, or running errands. I'd often spend Sunday evenings batch cooking meals that could be easily reheated during busy work weeks. My social life revolved around a close-knit group of fellow nurses and a few college friends who'd remained in the Denver area. We'd meet for dinner once or twice a month, sometimes catching a movie or trying a new restaurant. I wasn't much for bars or clubs, preferring quieter activities like hiking in the nearby mountains or visiting art museums. The mountains had become my refuge on difficult weeks. After losing a patient or dealing with particularly heartbreaking family situations, I'd drive to one of the nearby trails and spend hours walking among the aspen trees. The physical exertion and natural beauty helped me process the emotional weight of my job and return to work with renewed perspective. My relationship with my family had always been complicated, but I'd worked hard to establish healthy boundaries while maintaining connections. My parents, Robert and Carmen Martinez, still lived in the same 4-bedroom colonial house in Aurora where I'd grown up. The house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac with mature oak trees and well-maintained lawns, representing the middle-class stability my father had worked decades to achieve. Dad had spent 32 years as a maintenance supervisor for the Denver Public School District, taking pride in keeping school buildings safe and functional for thousands of students. Mom had worked part-time as a bookkeeper for various small businesses, allowing her to be home when my sister Brianna and I were young while still contributing to the household income. The house itself held countless memories, both wonderful and frustrating. The kitchen was the heart of our family life, with its yellow walls and oak cabinets that Mom had painted and repainted multiple times over the years. The living room featured a sectional sofa that had survived decades of family movie nights and homework sessions. Upstairs, 4 bedrooms had housed our family comfortably, including the room that had been mine from age 7 until I moved out at 23. My childhood bedroom had been my sanctuary, painted lavender at my insistence when I turned 12. I had arranged and rearranged the furniture countless times, creating different configurations as my interests changed from dolls to books to studying for college entrance exams. The large window faced east, providing beautiful morning light and a view of the neighbor's cherry tree that blooms spectacularly each spring. That room had witnessed my transformation from a shy elementary school student to a determined young woman ready to pursue her dreams in healthcare. I had spent countless hours at the white desk studying for exams, writing college application essays, and researching nursing programs. The walls had displayed my academic achievements, volunteer certificates, and eventually my nursing school acceptance letter. When I'd moved out 8 years ago to start my career, leaving that room felt like closing one chapter and opening another. I'd packed my belongings carefully, taking everything that represented who I was becoming while leaving behind items that belonged to my childhood. The transition had been emotional but necessary, marking my official entry into independent adulthood.
Growing up in the Martinez household meant understanding an unspoken hierarchy that had been established long before I was old enough to recognize it. My sister Brianna, 3 years younger than me, had always occupied a different position in our family dynamic. Where I was expected to be responsible and self-sufficient, Brianna was protected and accommodated in ways that seemed natural to everyone except me. The pattern began early. When I was 10 and Brianna was 7, I received a used bicycle for my birthday that Dad had found at a garage sale and spent weeks refurbishing. He'd repainted it bright blue and replaced the worn seat, taking pride in making it look almost new. 3 months later, Brianna received a brand new pink bicycle with streamers and a bell, simply because she'd mentioned wanting one while we were at the toy store. When I questioned why her bike was new while mine was used, Mom explained that Brianna was smaller and needed a bike that fit her perfectly for safety reasons. The explanation seemed reasonable at the time, but it established a precedent that would repeat throughout our childhood. Brianna's needs were immediate and non-negotiable, while mine could be met creatively or delayed until more convenient. This dynamic extended into our teenage years in ways that shaped both our personalities and our relationship with each other. Brianna developed an expectation that her problems would be solved by others, while I learned to solve my own problems and often hers as well. When she struggled with algebra in 8th grade, I spent hours tutoring her. When she forgot about a science project until the night before it was due, I helped her complete it while she watched television. Our parents praised me for being such a good big sister, for being responsible and helpful. But they also began to rely on me to manage situations involving Brianna, creating a dynamic where I felt responsible for her success and happiness. If she failed a test, they'd ask why I hadn't helped her study. If she got in trouble at school, they'd wonder why I hadn't been watching out for her. The bedroom situation in our house had always been a source of subtle tension. When we first moved to the Colonial in Aurora, there were 4 bedrooms, the master bedroom for our parents and 3 additional rooms. The largest of these became mine, partly because I was older, and partly because Brianna preferred the smaller room that connected to a shared bathroom. She liked being closer to our parents' room and didn't mind the smaller space. My room was approximately 12 by 14 feet, with 2 large windows, a walk-in closet, and enough space for a full-size bed, desk, dresser, and bookshelf. I'd spent years making it my own, painting the walls, arranging furniture, and creating spaces for studying and relaxation. The room reflected my personality and interests, from the academic achievement certificates on the walls to the carefully organized bookshelf filled with novels and nursing textbooks. Brianna's room was smaller, but had character features that mine lacked, including built-in shelving and a window seat that looked out onto the backyard garden. She'd never seemed particularly interested in decorating or personalizing her space, leaving the walls mostly bare and her belongings scattered rather than organized. Her room felt more like a place where she stored her things than a space she'd created for herself.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Throughout high school, I noticed subtle shifts in how our parents treated our respective spaces. My room was subject to inspection and criticism. Mom would comment on the messiness if I left textbooks on my desk or clothes on my chair while studying. Dad would suggest I needed to organize better or clean more frequently. But Brianna's room, even when genuinely messy with clothes on the floor and dishes left on surfaces, was rarely mentioned or criticized. When I left for nursing school at 18, moving into a dorm 3 hours away, Brianna was 15 and still living at home. During my college years, I'd return for holidays and summer breaks, staying in my childhood room and falling back into familiar patterns. The room remained essentially unchanged, with my parents treating it as my space, even though I was only there intermittently. After graduating nursing school and starting my position at Children's Hospital, I moved into my studio apartment and visited home less frequently. My schedule was demanding, with rotating shifts and the emotional intensity of NICU work making it difficult to maintain the same level of family involvement I'd had during college. I'd visit for major holidays and occasional Sunday dinners, But my childhood room became more of a guest room that happened to contain my childhood belongings. Brianna, meanwhile, had struggled to find her direction after high school. She'd enrolled in community college with plans to study graphic design, but dropped out after one semester, claiming the professors were boring and the coursework was too demanding. She'd worked a series of part-time jobs in retail and food service, never staying anywhere longer than 8 months. Her relationships followed a similar pattern. She'd date someone intensively for a few months, becoming completely absorbed in the relationship and making dramatic proclamations about love and future plans. Then something would go wrong, usually involving her partner's lack of attention or failure to meet her expectations, and she'd end the relationship with equal drama, requiring weeks of family support to recover from the heartbreak. Throughout these cycles, Brianna continued living at home, paying minimal rent, and receiving what amounted to full room and board from our parents. Mom would make excuses about Brianna needing time to find herself, while Dad would express frustration privately but avoid confronting the situation directly. They seemed caught between wanting her to become independent and being afraid to push her too hard. During my visits home, I began noticing small changes that suggested Brianna was expanding her presence beyond her own room. Items that belonged to her would appear in common areas and stay there for weeks. She'd taken over the main bathroom, filling it with her extensive collection of beauty products and leaving little space for anyone else's items. The kitchen counters would be cluttered with her specialty foods and supplements, purchased with money she'd somehow found despite working only part-time. More concerning were the subtle ways she'd begun testing boundaries around my old room. During one holiday visit, I'd found her sleeping in my bed, claiming her room was too cold and she'd forgotten I was coming. Another time, I'd discovered she'd been using my desk as a workspace for various craft projects, leaving glue and fabric scraps on the surface I'd once used for studying. When I'd mentioned these incidents to our parents, they'd minimize the situation, suggesting that Brianna was just trying to make use of empty space and that I shouldn't be territorial about a room I rarely used. The conversations left me feeling petty and possessive, even though something about the situation felt fundamentally wrong. The most unsettling incident occurred during a Christmas visit 2 years ago. I'd arrived home to find several items from my room had been moved or were missing entirely. A jewelry box I'd received as a high school graduation gift was no longer on my dresser. Some books had been relocated to other parts of the house. When I asked Brianna about it, she claimed she'd been helping Mom declutter and hadn't realized I still wanted those things. Mom had supported Brianna's version of events, suggesting that I couldn't expect to store belongings in their house indefinitely without them being reorganized occasionally. The conversation made me feel like I was being unreasonable, but it also made me realize how tenuous my connection to my childhood home had become.
Around this time, I also started noticing changes in Brianna's attitude toward me during family gatherings. Where she'd once been genuinely glad to see me, now there seemed to be an undercurrent of resentment or competition. She'd make subtle comments about my career, suggesting that being a nurse wasn't as impressive as I thought it was, or mentioning that she knew people making more money in jobs that required less education. She'd also begun making references to feeling like the only child who really cared about our parents, since I was always too busy with work to visit regularly. These comments stung because they contained a grain of truth. My demanding career did limit my availability, but they also felt manipulative and designed to make me feel guilty for living my own life. Our parents seemed oblivious to these undercurrents, or perhaps they chose to ignore them to maintain family harmony. They'd praise both of us equally during gatherings, but I noticed that Brianna's accomplishments required much lower standards. If she completed a week at a new job, it was celebrated with the same enthusiasm as my professional certifications or academic achievements. The warning signs were accumulating, but I told myself they were normal family tensions that would resolve themselves as Brianna matured and found her own path. I couldn't have imagined how dramatically the situation would escalate, or how my own life circumstances would soon force me back into the middle of dynamics I thought I'd left behind. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in March while I was in the middle of administering medication to a 28-week preemie named Sophia. My phone vibrated against my scrubs pocket with the special ringtone I'd assigned to family calls, but hospital policy required that I finish my current task before checking any personal messages. After ensuring Sophia's IV was secure and documenting the medication administration, I stepped into the supply room to return the call. Mom's voice sounded strained and unusually formal when she answered. "Jessica,
I need you to come home this weekend. There's been a situation with your father, and we need to discuss some changes as a family. The vagueness of her statement immediately triggered my anxiety. In our family, situation was code for something serious that couldn't be discussed over the phone, and changes meant upheaval that would somehow require sacrifice from me. What kind of situation? I pressed, pulling out my schedule to see when I might be able to make the 3-hour drive to Aurora. Is Dad okay? Has something happened with his health? There was a pause that lasted too long, filled with the kind of silence that carries weight. He's had some complications with his back surgery. The recovery isn't going as planned, and there are financial implications we need to address together. Can you be here Saturday morning? Back surgery. The words hit me with delayed comprehension. Dad had mentioned some ongoing pain in his lower back during our last phone conversation, but he'd minimized it as typical wear and tear from decades of physical work. He certainly hadn't mentioned scheduling surgery or that the situation had become serious enough to require family intervention. When did he have surgery? I asked, feeling a familiar mixture of hurt and frustration that major family events were happening without my knowledge. Why didn't anyone tell me he was having an operation? Mom's defensive tone kicked in immediately. It was supposed to be routine, Jessica. We didn't want to worry you unnecessarily when you're so busy with work. But now the recovery is taking longer than expected, and we need to make some adjustments. The word adjustments sent another wave of apprehension through me. In our family's vocabulary, adjustments typically meant that I would be expected to provide financial or practical support, while Brianna would be protected from any inconvenience. I'd learned this pattern through years of family crises where my stability and resources were treated as insurance policies for everyone else's problems. I'll be there Saturday morning, I confirmed, already mentally rearranging my weekend plans and wondering what kind of financial emergency could require a family meeting. After ending the call, I stood in the supply room for several minutes, trying to process the information and prepare myself for whatever revelation awaited me at home. The drive to Aurora on Saturday morning felt longer than usual, my mind cycling through possible scenarios. Maybe Dad needed extended physical therapy that wasn't fully covered by insurance. Perhaps he'd need modifications to the house to accommodate mobility limitations. I'd already started calculating how much I could realistically contribute from my savings without derailing my house buying timeline. When I arrived at the familiar Colonial, Dad was sitting in his recliner in the living room, looking pale and uncomfortable, but not as incapacitated as I'd expected. He was wearing a back brace that was visible beneath his loose shirt, and he moved carefully when he got up to hug me, but he was mobile and alert. The relief I felt was immediately tempered by confusion about why the situation required an emergency family meeting. Mom had prepared an elaborate brunch spread, which was always a sign that she was anxious about delivering difficult news. She'd made my favorite blueberry pancakes, crispy bacon, and fresh squeezed orange juice, the kind of meal she typically reserved for major holidays or significant announcements. Brianna emerged from upstairs wearing pajama pants and an oversized sweatshirt, looking like she'd just woken up despite it being nearly 11 in the morning. We ate in relative silence, with Mom making nervous small talk about the weather and asking about my work. Dad seemed uncomfortable, shifting frequently in his chair and wincing occasionally. Brianna scrolled through her phone between bites, seemingly unconcerned about whatever crisis had prompted this gathering. After we finished eating and Mom had cleared the dishes, Dad cleared his throat and began what was clearly a prepared speech. Jessica, as you know, the back surgery didn't go exactly as planned. I'm going to need several more months of recovery before I can return to full duty at work. The district is providing some disability benefits, but it's significantly less than my regular salary. I nodded, waiting for the specific request I knew was coming. How much less? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral and supportive. About 40% less, Mom interjected, which means we need to make some adjustments to our household expenses to manage until your father can work normally again. The word adjustments appeared again, and I braced myself for the impact. What kind of adjustments are you thinking about? Dad looked uncomfortable, glancing at Mom before continuing. We've been looking at ways to reduce our monthly expenses, and we've realized that we're not making the most efficient use of the space in this house. We think it might be time to consider renting out one of the bedrooms to help offset the reduced income. My stomach dropped as the implications became clear. You want to rent out my room, I said, the words coming out flatter than I'd intended. Well, Brianna has been thinking about needing more space for her art projects, Mom said, jumping in with an explanation that felt rehearsed. And since you have your own apartment and rarely stay here anymore, it seems like the logical solution would be for her to move into the larger room and we could rent out her smaller room to someone who needs a place to stay. The casual way she presented this complete rearrangement of our family dynamics left me speechless for several seconds. I looked around the table at their faces, trying to read the situation. Dad looked genuinely apologetic but resigned. Mom appeared nervous but determined. Brianna was still looking at her phone, but I caught a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. So Brianna would take my room and you'd rent out her room to a stranger? I said, slowly working through the logic. Have you discussed this with Brianna? Of course we have, Mom replied quickly. She's very excited about having more space for her creative work. She's been wanting to set up a proper art studio, and your room would be perfect for that. I turned to look at Brianna directly. Is that what you want? I asked her. She finally looked up from her phone, meeting my eyes with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. It would be really helpful for my projects, she said, her tone carefully neutral. And it makes sense financially for the family. The phrase, for the family, hit me wrong. Since when was Brianna concerned about family finances? She'd never contributed significantly to household expenses or shown interest in the practical aspects of maintaining our parents' home. But now she was presenting herself as someone making sacrifices for the greater good. What about my things? I asked, realizing how possessive I sounded, but unable to stop myself. All of my books, my furniture, my childhood belongings, they're all in that room. We can help you move anything you want to keep, Mom said, soothingly. Though honestly, Jessica, you might want to consider whether you really need to hold on to so many things from your teenage years. It might be time to let go of some of that clutter and embrace a more minimalist lifestyle. The word clutter stung. Those items weren't clutter to me. They were pieces of my history, markers of who I'd been and who I'd become. My academic awards, my nursing school textbooks, the desk that I'd written college application essays, these things had meaning that apparently no one else in my family understood or valued. When would this transition happen? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady.
Dad shifted uncomfortably again. Well, we've already found someone interested in renting the smaller room, a nursing student at the community college who seems very responsible and quiet. She could move in as early as next weekend if we can get everything arranged. Next weekend? 7 days to process the complete elimination of my childhood sanctuary and family anchor point. 7 days for Brianna to claim the space I'd inhabited for 15 years and transform it into her personal art studio. I felt a strange disconnection from my body, as if I were watching this conversation happen to someone else. The rational part of my mind understood their financial pressures and could even acknowledge the logic of their solution. But the emotional impact felt disproportionately devastating. Like they were erasing not just my room, but my place in the family story. Have you considered other options? I heard myself asking. Maybe I could contribute something monthly to help with expenses, and you wouldn't need to rent out a room at all. Mom and Dad exchanged a look that told me this option had been considered and dismissed. Jessica, you're building your own life and saving for your own house. We can't ask you to delay your goals to subsidize our situation. This arrangement will work out better for everyone. The phrase, everyone, kept appearing in their explanations, but I wondered if
everyone actually included me, or if it referred only to the 3 people who would continue living in this house while I became an occasional visitor with no permanent connection to the place I'd called home for most of my life. I spent the rest of that Saturday afternoon in my room, looking at everything with new eyes. The lavender walls I'd chosen and painted myself, the bookshelf filled with novels that had shaped my teenage worldview, the desk where I'd studied for exams that determined my future career, the window that had provided morning light for countless childhood mornings. By evening, I'd agreed to their plan, not because I thought it was fair or right, but because refusing seemed petty and selfish in the face of Dad's health situation and their genuine financial stress. I told myself that it was just a room, that I had my own life and my own space now, and that holding on to childhood attachments was preventing me from fully embracing adulthood. But as I packed my car that Sunday morning with the most precious items from my room, leaving behind furniture and belongings that would soon be rearranged according to Brianna's preferences, I felt like I was losing more than just a physical space. I was losing my place in the family story, my connection to the person I'd been before I became who I was now. The 3-hour drive back to Denver felt like traveling between 2 different versions of myself, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just agreed to something that would change our family dynamics in ways none of us fully understood. The weeks following that devastating family meeting brought a series of small humiliations that felt designed to erase any remaining connection I had to my childhood home. Mom would send me cheerful text updates about the renovation progress, describing how beautiful Brianna's new art studio was becoming and how happy the new renter seemed with her accommodations. Each message felt like a small knife twist, reminding me that my displacement was being celebrated as a success story. The new renter turned out to be a 22-year-old nursing student named Ashley, who was completing her clinical rotations at various Denver area hospitals. Mom described her as sweet and responsible, someone who kept her space immaculate and never made noise after 10 in the evening. The implicit comparison to my own messier teenage years wasn't lost on me, though I'd never received complaints about noise or cleanliness when I actually lived there. 3 weeks after agreeing to the room swap, I received a package in the mail containing items my family had decided I might want from my old space. Opening the box felt like receiving my own belongings back as charity. Inside were random items that clearly reflected someone else's judgment about what held value, a few childhood stuffed animals, some academic certificates, and a handful of books that had apparently been deemed worth saving. Missing from the package were items I would have specifically requested if anyone had asked. My high school yearbooks weren't there, nor was the jewelry box my grandmother had given me for my 16th birthday. When I called Mom to ask about these missing pieces, she sounded genuinely surprised that I cared about them. "Oh, honey, I think those might have gotten mixed in with things we donated to Goodwill. Brianna was helping me sort through everything, and we were trying to be efficient about clearing space. I'm sure we can replace the jewelry box if it's important to you." The casual dismissal of irreplaceable sentimental items as things that could be replaced revealed how little my family understood what those objects had meant to me. The jewelry box wasn't valuable because of its monetary worth. It was precious because it connected me to my grandmother's memory and represented a milestone in my teenage years. But explaining this would only make me sound materialistic and petty. I began dreading family communications because they invariably contained updates about improvements being made to what had been my space.
Mom would mention that Brianna had painted the walls a dramatic sage green and hung her artwork in carefully arranged galleries. She'd installed better lighting for her projects and rearranged the furniture to create distinct zones for different creative activities. The descriptions stung, not because I begrudged Brianna her happiness, but because they highlighted how thoroughly my presence had been erased and replaced, as if those 15 years of my life in that room had never happened, as if the space had always been destined for someone else's dreams and ambitions.
Dad's recovery progressed more slowly than anyone had anticipated, requiring additional physical therapy sessions and extended leave from his maintenance supervisor position. This created ongoing financial pressure that my family seemed to expect me to help resolve, despite having already sacrificed my childhood room to their solution. The requests started small and reasonable. Could I help pay for Dad's specialized physical therapy sessions that weren't fully covered by insurance? The copays were only $40 each, and he needed 3 sessions per week for 6 weeks. I agreed immediately, calculating that $720 was manageable and clearly related to his medical needs. 2 weeks later, Mom called asking if I could contribute to their grocery expenses because feeding an additional person, the renter Ashley, had increased their monthly food costs more than expected. This request felt less reasonable since Ashley was paying rent specifically to offset household expenses, but I agreed to send $200 monthly for 3 months to help them adjust to the new arrangement. The financial requests continued with increasing frequency and decreasing justification. Could I help with the utility deposit for upgrading their internet service, since Ashley needed reliable connection for her online nursing courses? Could I contribute to the cost of new furniture for the living room, since they were hosting a renter and wanted the common areas to look presentable? Each individual request seemed modest and reasonable, but the cumulative effect was a steady drain on my carefully planned savings. More troubling was the pattern emerging around these requests. Brianna never contributed to any of these expenses, despite living rent-free and having taken over the prime bedroom in the house. Her art supplies and studio improvements seemed to be funded without question, while I was expected to subsidize basic household needs. When I gently suggested that Brianna might also contribute to Dad's medical expenses or household costs, Mom's response was swift and defensive. Brianna is going through a transitional period right now, trying to establish her art career. We can't burden her with financial pressures when she's finally found her passion and is working so hard to develop her talents. The phrase transitional period had been applied to Brianna's situation for several years now, apparently extending indefinitely as long as it served to justify her lack of contribution to family responsibilities. Meanwhile, my successful career and financial stability seemed to automatically volunteer me for every expense that arose. 3 months after the room transition, I made my first visit back to Aurora since the day I agreed to give up my space. The experience was jarring in ways I hadn't anticipated. Walking into the house felt familiar and foreign simultaneously, like returning to a place that had been redecorated by strangers who didn't understand the original design. Brianna's transformation of my former room was dramatic and complete. She'd painted the walls a deep forest green that made the space feel smaller and darker than I remembered. Easels and canvases occupied every corner, with art supplies organized in systems that reflected her personality rather than mine. The morning light that had once illuminated my study sessions now highlighted oil paintings and charcoal sketches that bore no relationship to my memories of that space. What disturbed me most was how comfortable and settled Brianna appeared in the room. She gave me a tour with obvious pride, explaining her organizational systems and pointing out improvements she'd made. She'd installed additional electrical outlets for her equipment and rearranged the furniture to optimize her workspace.
The room had clearly become hers in ways that went beyond simple occupancy. Ashley, the renter in Brianna's former room, seemed pleasant but essentially invisible in the family dynamic. She kept her belongings contained to her small space and appeared to treat the common areas as shared spaces where she was a respectful guest. Her presence felt much less intrusive than I had expected, which made me realize that the room swap hadn't really been about accommodating a renter at all. During that visit, I overheard a phone conversation between Brianna and one of her friends that provided uncomfortable insight into her perspective on our situation. She was describing her new art studio with obvious satisfaction, mentioning how much better the larger space was for her creative work, and how she'd always felt cramped in the smaller room. The thing is, she said to her friend, Jessica was never really using it anyway. She has her own apartment and hardly ever comes home. It makes so much more sense for someone who actually lives here to have the better room. The casual dismissal of my connection to that space felt like a punch to the stomach. In Brianna's version of events, I had voluntarily abandoned a room I no longer needed, rather than being pressured to sacrifice something meaningful for the family's financial benefit. She'd rewritten the narrative to make herself the logical beneficiary of an underutilized resource, rather than someone who had displaced her sister. When I attempted to address these growing concerns with my parents, their responses revealed how thoroughly they'd accepted Brianna's version of reality. They spoke about the room transition as if it had been a natural evolution that benefited everyone involved. My emotional attachment to the space was treated as nostalgia that I needed to outgrow, rather than a legitimate sense of loss. Mom particularly seemed invested in framing the situation as positive character development for me. This is good for you, Jessica. You're learning to let go of material attachments and focus on what really matters. You have your own life now, your own space to make your own choices about. Isn't that more important than holding on to a childhood bedroom? The logic was simultaneously reasonable and infuriating. Yes, I had my own life and my own space, but that didn't mean my connection to my family home was insignificant or unhealthy.
Other families managed to maintain children's rooms as spaces they could return to without those rooms being considered wasted resources. Dad's perspective was more conflicted, but ultimately aligned with the family's new arrangement. I can understand why this feels unfair to you, he admitted during a private conversation. But the financial reality is that we need to make practical decisions based on our current situation, not sentimental attachments to how things used to be. His words carried an undertone suggesting that my feelings about the room were impractical sentimentality rather than legitimate emotional needs. The message was clear. My attachment to that space was a luxury the family could no longer afford, and my resistance to the change reflected immaturity rather than reasonable grief over a significant loss. The most painful aspect of these failed attempts at communication was realizing that my family genuinely believed their actions were reasonable and that my distress was disproportionate. They weren't deliberately trying to hurt me, which somehow made the situation worse than if they'd been consciously unfair. Their casual dismissal of my feelings reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what that room had represented in my life and what its loss meant to my sense of belonging in our family. By the end of that difficult visit, I understood that no amount of explanation or emotional honesty would change their perspective on what had happened. They'd found a solution that worked for everyone who still lived in that house, and my outside perspective was treated as irrelevant to their daily reality. I was expected to adapt to their new arrangement with gratitude for having been included in the decision at all. The drive back to Denver felt like crossing an invisible boundary between the family I'd thought I belonged to and the reality of my actual place in their lives. I was a successful, independent adult who could be called upon for financial assistance and emotional support, but whose own emotional needs were secondary to the convenience of those who remained in the family home. The breaking point came 6 months later in a way I never could have anticipated.
I was reviewing my monthly budget on a quiet Sunday evening when I realized that the steady stream of family contributions had depleted my house fund by nearly $12,000. What had started as helping with Dad's medical expenses had evolved into subsidizing their entire household, while Brianna contributed nothing and lived rent-free in what had been my childhood sanctuary. The revelation hit me with startling clarity as I stared at my bank statement spread across my kitchen table. I'd been so focused on being the good daughter, the responsible sister, that I'd allowed myself to become an external funding source for a family that had restructured itself around my absence while expecting my continued financial presence. That same evening, I received a call that would change everything. My landlord, Mrs. Chen, was selling my building to developers who planned to demolish it for a luxury condominium project. All tenants would need to vacate within 60 days, regardless of lease terms, though we'd receive modest relocation assistance that wouldn't begin to cover the cost of finding comparable housing in Denver's inflated rental market. The timing felt like a cruel cosmic joke. After spending months watching my savings drain away to support my family's new lifestyle, I now faced the prospect of finding a new apartment in a market where rents had increased by 30% since I had originally signed my lease. My carefully constructed independence was crumbling, and the financial cushion I built over years of disciplined saving had been voluntarily depleted to help people who seemed to have forgotten I existed, except when they needed money. I spent the next 3 days researching rental options and running calculations that all led to the same devastating conclusion. With my reduced savings and the current market rates, I couldn't afford anything comparable to what I was losing. The apartments within my budget were either in unsafe neighborhoods, had commutes that would add 2 hours daily to my work schedule, or were so small that I'd be living in conditions worse than a college dorm room. The most viable options were studio apartments in older buildings with unreliable heating and no laundry facilities, priced at what I'd been paying for my current space that included amenities I'd taken for granted. Moving into one of these alternatives would mean sacrificing the comfortable, organized lifestyle I'd worked years to achieve, essentially starting over financially and personally. On Thursday evening, as I sat in my soon-to-be-demolished apartment, surrounded by rental listings that all represented significant downgrades from my current situation, I found myself considering the option I'd been avoiding. I could move back home temporarily, just long enough to rebuild my savings and find a better long-term solution. The idea initially felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that my independence had been more fragile than I'd believed. But as I worked through the practical aspects, it began to seem like the most logical choice available. I could save money, help Dad with his ongoing recovery, and take time to find a rental situation that actually met my needs rather than desperately accepting whatever I could afford immediately. The next morning, I called Mom to explain my situation and ask about the possibility of staying in their guest room temporarily. Her response was immediately enthusiastic, almost suspiciously so, as if she'd been hoping for exactly this development. "Oh, Jessica, that's wonderful news. Well, not wonderful that you're losing your apartment, but wonderful that you'll be coming home for a while. Your father will be so pleased to have you here during his recovery, and it'll be nice to have the family together again." Her enthusiasm felt genuine, but something in her tone suggested she was already making plans that extended beyond simply offering me a temporary place to stay. When I asked about logistics and timing, she mentioned that I could stay as long as I needed, but we'd need to work out some arrangements since the house dynamics had changed since I'd lived there.
What kind of arrangements? I asked, though I already suspected the answer would involve complications I hadn't anticipated. "Well, we'll need to figure out sleeping arrangements," she said carefully. "Ashley is still renting Brianna's old room, and Brianna has really settled into the larger room with all her art supplies and equipment. It might be disruptive to ask her to move everything again, especially when this is just temporary for you." The implication was clear. I'd be returning to a house where my former bedroom was now permanently Brianna's domain, and I'd be expected to find alternative accommodation within the same space I'd grown up in. The guest room Mom referenced was actually the smallest bedroom in the house, originally intended as a home office, with no closet and barely enough space for a twin bed and dresser. I felt a familiar surge of frustration at how quickly my emergency situation was being reframed around Brianna's convenience. But I was in no position to negotiate from strength. The reality was that I needed a place to stay, and my options were limited by both time constraints and financial resources. Over the weekend, I developed a strategic plan for managing this transition in a way that would protect my long-term interests while minimizing family conflict. First, I would establish clear boundaries about the temporary nature of my stay, with a specific timeline for finding alternative housing. Second, I would document any financial contributions I made to household expenses to avoid the pattern of unacknowledged support that had drained my savings. Third, I would maintain my own space and belongings separately from family areas to preserve my independence. Most importantly, I would use this time to rebuild my financial resources while actively searching for a permanent housing solution that met my actual needs rather than accepting whatever was available under pressure. Moving home would be a strategic retreat, not a permanent surrender of my independence. I scheduled time off work to coordinate the move, arranging for a storage unit to hold furniture and belongings that wouldn't fit in the small guest room. The process of downsizing my life to fit into a space smaller than my current bedroom felt like a regression, but I framed it as a temporary sacrifice for long-term gain. My coworkers at the hospital were supportive, but concerned about my decision to move back home. Several of them had their own complicated family relationships and warned me about the challenges of reestablishing adult independence after returning to childhood dynamics. Just remember that you're a grown woman with your own career and your own life, my colleague Sarah warned during our lunch break. Don't let them treat you like you're 18 again, just because you're sleeping in their house. Her words resonated because they addressed my deepest fear about this arrangement. I'd worked hard to establish myself as an independent adult with professional credibility and personal autonomy. Moving back home risked undermining that identity if I allowed myself to fall back into old family patterns where my needs were secondary to everyone else's convenience. I spent considerable time researching tenant rights and family housing arrangements to understand my legal position in case conflicts arose. While I wouldn't be paying market rate rent, I planned to contribute fairly to household expenses and wanted to ensure that my contributions were acknowledged and my temporary residence status was respected. The most challenging aspect of planning this transition was managing my own emotions around returning to a space that no longer felt like home. The house I'd grown up in had been restructured around my absence, with my former rooms serving as Brianna's art studio and a stranger occupying the space that had been hers. I'd be returning as a guest in a place where I once belonged. But I also recognized that the situation offered opportunities that weren't available in my current crisis. Living at home would allow me to rebuild my savings quickly, with minimal housing expenses freeing up money for my future house fund. I'd be able to help Dad with his recovery while also having support during my own housing transition. Most importantly, I'd have time to make thoughtful decisions about my next living situation rather than accepting whatever was immediately available under pressure. The week before my move, I had dinner with my closest friend from nursing school, Maria, who had listened to my family stories for years and understood the complicated dynamics involved. "You know what I think?" she said over our shared appetizer. "This might be exactly what your family needs to understand how much they've been taking you for granted. When you're there every day, contributing to the household and helping with your dad's care, they'll see what you actually bring to their lives instead of just viewing you as an ATM they can call when they need money." Her words offered a more empowering frame for my decision. Instead of seeing this as a retreat or failure, I could view it as an opportunity to reset family relationships from a position of strength rather than distance. I'd be present and involved, but as an adult with clear boundaries and expectations, rather than the accommodating daughter who had accepted every request without question. As I packed my belongings for the move back home, I felt a mixture of apprehension and determination. This transition would test my ability to maintain my adult identity within my childhood environment,
But it would also provide an opportunity to rebuild my financial foundation and potentially establish healthier family dynamics. The next chapter of my life would begin in the house where I'd grown up, but I was determined to write it on my own terms.
Moving day arrived on a gray Saturday morning in October with the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything feel more difficult than it should have been. I'd rented a small truck and enlisted 2 coworkers to help transport my belongings to Aurora, planning to complete the entire move in one day to minimize disruption to everyone's schedules. The first sign that this transition wouldn't go as smoothly as I'd planned came when we pulled into my parents' driveway at 9 in the morning. Brianna's car was missing, and when I called to ask where she was, Mom explained that she'd gone to stay with a friend for the weekend because she found moving day stressful and didn't want to be in the way. Her absence felt strategic rather than considerate. By not being present during my return, she avoided any awkwardness about me seeing how completely she'd claimed what had been my space, while also dodging any expectation that she might help with the physical work of moving my belongings into the house. The guest room that would serve as my temporary accommodation was even smaller than I had remembered, approximately 8 by 10 feet with a single window facing the neighbor's fence. The previous occupant had been boxes of Christmas decorations and old tax documents, which Mom and Dad had hastily relocated to the basement to make space for my arrival. Standing in that cramped room with my coworkers, trying to figure out how to arrange my belongings in a space that couldn't accommodate even my basic furniture, I felt a wave of depression that I had to quickly suppress. This was supposed to be a strategic retreat, a temporary inconvenience that would allow me to rebuild my financial foundation. Instead, it felt like a regression to a version of myself I'd outgrown years ago. My dresser barely fit against one wall, leaving inches of clearance for the door to open fully. My desk had to be positioned under the window at an angle that made it uncomfortable to use for extended periods. The twin bed that had been moved from the basement took up most of the remaining floor space, making the room feel more like a storage closet than a living space. Most of my belongings ended up in the storage unit I'd rented across town, including all of my books, most of my clothes, and the furniture that had made my apartment feel like home. I kept only the essentials needed for daily functioning, but even those minimal possessions made the small room feel cluttered and cramped. Dad helped as much as his back condition allowed, but I could see that the physical activity was challenging for him. His recovery had progressed more slowly than expected, and he still moved carefully, avoiding any lifting or bending that might aggravate his injury. His limitations made me realize how much his reduced mobility had contributed to the family's financial stress and their need to find alternative sources of support. By early afternoon, we'd moved everything that would fit into the house, and my coworkers had left with promises to check on me in a few weeks. I spent the rest of the day trying to organize my possessions in a way that would make the tiny room functional, while Mom prepared a welcome home dinner with all of my favorite foods. The dinner conversation was awkward in ways that highlighted how much had changed since I'd lived there regularly. Ashley joined us, and while she was polite and pleasant, her presence created an odd dynamic where I felt like a guest at my own family's table. She knew details about my parents' daily routines and recent experiences that I didn't, having been part of their household for months while I'd been absent. Mom kept asking about my plans and timeline for finding a permanent place, questions that felt more like gentle pressure to not get too comfortable rather than genuine interest in my well-being. Dad was more direct, expressing concern about how I'd manage job stress while dealing with housing uncertainty, and suggesting that I might want to consider this an opportunity to spend more time with family. The most uncomfortable moment came when Mom mentioned that she'd need to discuss household contribution expectations with me soon, since my presence would increase utilities and grocery expenses. The casual way she raised the topic, as if charging me rent was obviously necessary, caught me off guard since we'd never discussed financial arrangements during our planning conversations. When I asked what kind of contributions she had in mind, she suggested we wait until Brianna returned to have that conversation as a family, since any changes would affect everyone in the household. The implication that Brianna would have input into my living arrangements and financial obligations felt both insulting and ominous.
That first night in the guest room was miserable. The twin bed was uncomfortable compared to my memory foam mattress, and the room stayed cold despite adjusting the thermostat. Every sound in the house seemed amplified, from Ashley's television in the next room to my parents' conversation in the kitchen below. I lay awake for hours, questioning whether I'd made a terrible mistake in giving up my independent living situation for this claustrophobic alternative. Sunday morning brought Brianna's return, and the family meeting I'd been dreading. She arrived mid-morning with coffee and pastries, greeting everyone warmly and acting as if my presence was a delightful surprise rather than something we'd been planning for weeks. She looked completely at ease in what had been my childhood home, moving through the spaces with the confidence of someone who belonged there without question. When she hugged me, her greeting felt performative, like she was demonstrating family affection for our parents' benefit, rather than expressing genuine emotion. The four of us gathered in the living room, with Ashley diplomatically retreating to her room to give us privacy for what Mom called our family discussion about household arrangements. The formal tone felt ominous, like I was about to receive terms for my continued residence rather than participating in a collaborative conversation.
Dad cleared his throat and began with what was clearly a prepared speech. Jessica, we're so glad you're home, even if the circumstances aren't ideal. We want to make sure this arrangement works well for everyone, which means we need to establish some guidelines and expectations. The word guidelines immediately put me on alert. In our family's vocabulary, guidelines typically meant rules that applied primarily to me while exempting Brianna from similar expectations. Mom jumped in with the financial details. Since you'll be staying here temporarily, we think it's fair for you to contribute to household expenses. We've calculated that your presence increases our monthly costs by about $600 when we factor in utilities, groceries, and general wear and tear. $600! The amount was significantly higher than I'd expected for someone occupying a tiny guest room with minimal belongings. For comparison, Ashley was paying $800 monthly for a larger room with closet space and her own bathroom access. When I asked for a breakdown of how they'd calculated that figure, Brianna spoke up for the first time. Well, you'll be using more electricity with all your medical equipment and study materials, plus your longer showers and different eating schedule will definitely increase costs. Her comment about medical equipment confused me until I realized she was referring to my laptop and phone chargers as if they were significant power consumers. The reference to longer showers was particularly irritating since I'd always been conscious about water usage and had never been criticized for excessive shower time during the years I'd lived there. The most revealing aspect of this conversation was what wasn't being discussed. There was no mention of my contributing to Dad's medical expenses or helping with household maintenance, tasks that would have provided tangible value to the family. Instead, the focus was entirely on me paying for the privilege of occupying space in a house where I'd grown up. When I suggested that $600 seemed high for someone staying temporarily in the smallest room, Mom's response revealed the true nature of their expectations. Jessica, you have a good job and no other major expenses now. $600 is very reasonable compared to what you'd pay for an apartment, and this gives you the security of family support while you figure out your next steps. The phrase, family support, felt hollow when it was immediately followed by financial demands that exceeded what many people paid for actual apartments. I was beginning to understand that my family viewed my return not as an emergency situation requiring temporary assistance, but as an opportunity to extract ongoing financial support while providing minimal accommodation in return. Brianna's contribution to this discussion was particularly galling. She expressed concern about how my presence might affect her creative work, mentioning that she'd need to adjust her schedule to accommodate someone else living in the house. She spoke as if my temporary residence was an imposition on her lifestyle, rather than a family member needing short-term support. The conversation concluded with an agreement that I'd pay $600 monthly, starting with my first full month of residence, along with contributing to groceries and utilities as needed.
The terms felt extractive rather than supportive, but I was in no position to negotiate from strength given my limited alternatives. That evening, as I sat in my cramped room trying to process what had just occurred, I realized that my strategic retreat had turned into something much more complicated. Rather than providing a foundation for rebuilding my independence, this arrangement threatened to trap me in a financially draining situation that benefited everyone except me. The family I'd thought would provide temporary support was instead treating my emergency as a business opportunity, charging me premium rates for substandard accommodation while expecting gratitude for their generosity. My childhood home had become a place where I was tolerated rather than welcomed, where my contributions were demanded rather than appreciated. As I calculated the true cost of this arrangement, including storage fees for my belongings and the emotional toll of living in such constrained circumstances, I began to question whether I'd made a fundamental error in judgment. The next 7 months would test not only my financial resilience, but my ability to maintain my sense of self while navigating family dynamics that seemed designed to diminish my autonomy and extract my resources. The breaking point arrived 3 months into my stay at home, on a February evening that started like any other, but ended with a confrontation that would permanently reshape our family dynamics. I had just finished a particularly brutal 12-hour shift in the NICU, losing a 24-week preemie whose parents had named Michael and who had fought for 3 weeks before his tiny body couldn't continue the battle. Days like this were why I'd always treasured coming home to my own space where I could process grief privately and decompress from the emotional intensity of my work. Instead, I returned to find the house filled with Brianna's friends, who had apparently decided to use the living room for an impromptu art critique session, complete with wine and loud music. When I asked if they could move their gathering to Brianna's room so I could have some quiet time in the common areas, Brianna looked at me with genuine irritation. "Jessica, this is my house too, and my friends are here to see my latest paintings. We can't all crowd into one room just because you had a hard day at work. Everyone has hard days." Her casual dismissal of my grief and her assertion that this was equally her house struck me like a physical blow. I retreated to my cramped room, closed the door, and for the first time since moving back home, allowed myself to cry. Not just for baby Michael and his devastated parents, but for the complete erosion of my place in my own family.
The final straw came 2 hours later when I discovered that someone had used my expensive shampoo and conditioner, leaving the bottles nearly empty. These weren't drugstore products, but salon-quality items I'd splurged on because my long shifts required that I maintain professional appearance standards with minimal time for hair care. When I mentioned this to the group in the living room, asking who had used my bathroom supplies, one of Brianna's friends laughed and said she'd borrowed some shampoo because she'd run out and didn't think anyone would mind. Brianna immediately defended her friend, suggesting that I was being petty about sharing basic toiletries with house guests. The phrase house guests ignited something inside me that had been building for months. I looked around at these people, treating my family home like their personal social club, using my belongings without permission, while I paid $600 monthly to sleep in a room smaller than most people's closets and endure constant noise and disruption. In that moment, the full scope of my family's manipulation became crystal clear. They had taken my childhood room and given it to Brianna permanently, while charging me premium rent to live like a boarder in my own family's house. They had positioned my emergency housing situation as an opportunity to extract ongoing financial support while providing minimal accommodation and zero respect for my needs. I stood up abruptly, walked to my tiny room, and began calculating exactly how much this arrangement was actually costing me. The $600 in monthly rent, plus my share of groceries, utilities, and the storage unit fees for my belongings, came to nearly $1,100 monthly. For that amount, I could rent a one-bedroom apartment in several Denver neighborhoods and have my own space, my own bathroom, and my own rules.
But the real revelation came when I calculated the opportunity cost of my depleted savings. The money I'd contributed to family expenses over the past year, combined with what I'd been paying to live in substandard conditions at home, represented a delay of at least 2 years in my house buying timeline. I had been subsidizing their lifestyle while sabotaging my own financial goals. That night, I made a series of phone calls that would change everything. First, I called 3 apartment complexes I'd researched months earlier, discovering that one had a last-minute cancellation on a 1-bedroom unit that would be available in 2 weeks. The rent was $850 monthly for a space with a full kitchen, bathroom, and living area significantly larger than my current accommodation. Next, I called my storage facility to arrange retrieval of my belongings, calculating that I could furnish the new apartment with items I already owned rather than starting over completely. Finally, I called my bank to transfer funds for the security deposit and first month's rent, feeling a surge of relief as I committed to reclaiming my independence. The hardest call was to my supervisor at the hospital, requesting a personal day to handle what I described as a family emergency. In a sense, it was exactly that, an emergency involving my need to extract myself from a toxic family situation that was compromising my mental health and financial stability. I spent that personal day apartment hunting and completing the rental application process, approaching the task with the same methodical precision I used for complex medical procedures. By evening, I had secured the apartment, arranged for movers, and established a timeline for extracting myself from my family's house within 10 days. The next phase involved strategic preparation for the conversations I knew would follow my announcement. I documented every financial contribution I'd made to household expenses, creating a spreadsheet that showed exactly how much money had flowed from me to them over the past year. The total was staggering. Over $18,000 in direct payments, plus the ongoing monthly rent and utilities. I also researched fair market rates for room rentals in Aurora, discovering that $600 monthly was significantly above average for a space the size of the guest room, especially one without private bathroom access or adequate storage. Armed with this information, I felt prepared to counter any arguments about the reasonableness of their financial demands. The announcement came on a Sunday morning when the entire family was gathered for Mom's traditional weekend breakfast. I waited until everyone had finished eating and the conversation had turned to plans for the coming week before making my statement. I wanted to let everyone know that I found an apartment and will be moving out in 8 days, I said, keeping my tone neutral and matter-of-fact. I've arranged for movers to come on Saturday morning to transport my belongings, and I'll have everything out by noon. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom was the first to respond, her voice rising with what sounded like genuine panic. Jessica, what are you talking about? You can't just decide to move out without discussing it with the family. We've made arrangements based on your being here. The phrase made arrangements revealed everything I needed to know about how they viewed my residence. I wasn't a family member receiving temporary support. I was a source of reliable income that they'd incorporated into their budget planning. Dad's response was more measured, but equally revealing. This seems very sudden, Jessica. Have you thought about the financial implications? You're going to pay significantly more for an apartment than what you contribute here, and you'll lose the benefit of family support. When I explained that my new apartment would actually cost less than what I was currently paying when all expenses were considered, his expression shifted from concern to something that looked like calculation, as if he were running numbers in his head to verify my claim. Brianna's reaction was the most eliminating of all. She seemed genuinely surprised that I was dissatisfied with the current arrangement, asking why I would want to live alone in some cramped apartment when she could stay with family in a house with a yard and an established community.
Her question revealed how completely she'd reframed the situation in her mind. In her version of reality, I was choosing isolation over family connection, prioritizing material comfort over emotional support. She seemed genuinely unable to understand that the current arrangement provided neither comfort nor support.
When I calmly explained that I'd been paying above market rates to live in substandard conditions while being treated like an inconvenient boarder rather than a family member, the defensive responses came quickly and predictably. Mom insisted that $600 was reasonable, given that I was living in their house and benefiting from family meals and utilities. Dad suggested that I was being ungrateful after all the support they'd provided during my housing crisis. Brianna accused me of being selfish and materialistic, prioritizing my own comfort over family unity. But something had fundamentally shifted in my perspective during those months of living in cramped conditions while subsidizing their lifestyle. Their arguments, which might have induced guilt and compliance in the past, now sounded hollow and manipulative. I remained calm throughout their protests, responding to each objection with facts rather than emotions. When Mom claimed I was paying reasonable rates, I shared my research on comparable room rentals. When Dad mentioned their support, I presented the spreadsheet showing the net financial flow from me to them. When Brianna accused me of selfishness, I pointed out that I'd been the only family member contributing financially to Dad's recovery expenses. The conversation continued for over an hour, with my family cycling through various emotional appeals and logical arguments designed to change my decision. They alternated between making me feel guilty for abandoning the family and attempting to convince me that I was making a poor financial choice. The turning point came when Brianna made a statement that revealed the true nature of their expectations. She suggested that since I was doing so well financially and didn't have a family of my own to support, it was natural that I should contribute more to help relatives who were struggling. Her casual assumption that my success obligated me to subsidize their lifestyle, combined with the implication that my life was somehow less valuable because I didn't have children, crystallized everything that was wrong with our family dynamic. I wasn't viewed as an individual with my own goals and needs, but as a resource that existed to solve problems for people whose choices had created their own difficulties. I stood up from the breakfast table and made my final statement. I love this family, but I won't continue to pay premium rates to be treated like an inconvenient tenant in my own childhood home. My decision is final, and I hope we can maintain a positive relationship that doesn't revolve around my financial contributions to your household expenses. The week that followed was filled with tension and passive-aggressive behavior designed to make me reconsider my decision. Brianna made pointed comments about how much my departure would hurt Dad's recovery process. Mom mentioned repeatedly how much they'd enjoyed having me home and how much they'd miss my presence. But there were also moments of unexpected honesty that suggested some family members were beginning to understand the unsustainability of the arrangement we'd been living with. Dad admitted privately that he'd become too comfortable relying on my financial contributions and needed to find more sustainable solutions to their budget challenges. Ashley, the renter, surprised me by expressing support for my decision, mentioning that she'd felt uncomfortable with how much financial pressure seemed to be placed on me compared to other family members. Her outside perspective validated my sense that the situation had been fundamentally unfair. Moving day arrived with an efficiency that reflected my experience with major life transitions. The professional movers I'd hired worked quickly and carefully, transferring my belongings from the cramped guest room and storage unit to my new one-bedroom apartment across town. As I watched my possessions being loaded into the truck, I felt a lightness that I hadn't experienced in months. These items, which had been scattered between a tiny room and a storage facility, would soon be arranged in a space where I could make all the decisions about organization, decoration, and daily routines. My family gathered to say goodbye, and the mood was complex, mixing genuine sadness with unresolved tension about my decision to leave. Mom cried and made me promise to visit regularly. Dad hugged me and whispered that he was proud of me for taking care of myself. Brianna's farewell was awkward, neither of us quite knowing how to navigate the changed dynamic between us. The first night in my new apartment was revelatory. As I arranged my furniture in configurations that pleased me, cooked dinner in my own kitchen, and took a long shower in my own bathroom without worrying about time limits or someone else's schedule, I remembered what independence actually felt like. The silence was profound and healing.
No television from neighboring rooms, no conversations in hallways, no friends of family members using my belongings without permission, just the quiet sounds of my own life unfolding in a space that belonged entirely to me. Over the following weeks, I established new routines that prioritized my own well-being and professional goals. I resumed my graduate school applications, something I had abandoned during the stress of living at home. I started cooking elaborate meals again, rediscovering the pleasure of creating nourishing food in my own kitchen.
Most importantly, I began rebuilding my savings with the same discipline that had originally created my financial stability. Without the constant drain of family contributions and excessive housing costs, I could return to putting away substantial amounts monthly toward my house fund. The impact on my work performance was immediate and positive. Returning to a peaceful home environment after difficult shifts allowed me to process emotional challenges more effectively and arrive at work refreshed rather than drained from household tension. My relationship with my family evolved gradually over the months that followed. Without the daily friction of living together and the ongoing financial pressure, we were able to interact more positively during planned visits and phone conversations. Brianna and I developed a more honest relationship, acknowledging the competitive dynamics that had damaged our connection for years. She admitted that she'd felt guilty about taking my room, but had justified it by telling herself I didn't really need it anymore. I acknowledged that I'd been resentful about always being expected to provide financial support, while her contributions to the family were never questioned. Mom and Dad slowly adjusted to managing their household expenses without my regular contributions, finding creative solutions and making lifestyle adjustments that should have been implemented years earlier. Dad's back improved enough for him to return to limited work duties, reducing their financial stress significantly. The most important lesson I learned through this experience was the difference between loving your family and enabling their dysfunction. True love sometimes requires setting boundaries that force everyone to grow rather than accepting patterns that benefit some family members at the expense of others. I also discovered that independence isn't just about having your own space. It's about maintaining the right to make decisions about your own life without being manipulated by guilt or obligation. Financial independence means nothing if you allow others to treat your resources as their safety net while expecting your needs to remain secondary. 1 year later, I'm thriving in ways that wouldn't have been possible if I'd remained trapped in my family's dysfunctional financial dynamics. My savings have recovered and grown beyond their previous levels. I've been accepted to a master's program that will advance my nursing career significantly. Most importantly, I've learned to value my own well-being enough to protect it from people who would sacrifice it for their convenience. The relationship with my family is healthier now than it's been in years, built on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. We spend time together because we choose to, not because I'm obligated to provide services or support that enable their avoidance of adult responsibilities. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is refuse to participate in patterns that prevent everyone from reaching their full potential. By walking away from an arrangement that was draining me while enabling them, I created space for all of us to develop healthier, more authentic relationships. If you're currently in a situation where your kindness is being exploited or your success is being treated as a family resource rather than personal achievement, remember that you have the right to prioritize your own well-being. Setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's necessary for creating relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided sacrifice. The most profound realization I had was that my family's love didn't depend on my financial contributions or my willingness to accept unfair treatment. Once I stopped providing those things, the relationships that remained were more honest and ultimately more valuable than the ones built on my compliance and financial support. Today, I live in a beautiful apartment that reflects my personal style and supports my professional goals. My savings account grows monthly toward the house I'll eventually buy. My relationship with my family is based on choice rather than obligation, making our time together more meaningful and authentic. The room that was once mine belongs to Brianna now, and that's okay. I've learned that home isn't a physical space, but a sense of security and belonging that you create for yourself.
And that kind of home can never be taken away by someone else's decisions or demands.
Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.